It's time again for Talking Trade, sponsored by MMAC's World Trade Association and Michael Best Strategies.
Welcome to another episode of Talking Trade. I'm Ken Wasylik, Managing Director of EM Wasylik & Associates, an international business development company.
And I'm Sandi, Siegel, President of ME Day. It's a pleasure to welcome and introduce our guest today, Sarah Helton. Sarah's a partner at Michael Best Strategies on the government relations team with extensive experience in the legal, federal policy, and political sectors, providing consulting services on policy issues to the businesses that they impact. Welcome, Sarah. Welcome to Talking Trade.
Thank you, Sandi. Thank you, Ken.
Welcome.
In today's political environment, I imagine you're quite busy and getting deluged with inquiries from your customers. Trade policy is certainly a popular topic these days, and it seems to be changing at a really rapid pace. So with some of these changes or proposed changes that have big impact on businesses, either sourcing, manufacturing, or trying to sell abroad, what are your thoughts in particular on some of the recently announced extensions of the 301 tariffs? We all thought they were going to end at the 4-year mark, and not only are they not ending, they're being extended another 4 years. And the President Biden recently announced additional products, on key sectors that will be hit dramatically with increased tariffs, things like the electric vehicles and so forth. So I wonder what your thoughts are on the political agenda, if there is one. Do you think this was a political exercise in light of the upcoming election, perhaps? Or is there really a master plan in all our negotiations with China and how we're trying to manage that through trade?
Sandi, great question. And this was a tremendous action that the Biden administration just released over the past couple weeks. The reason why I say it's tremendous is, Sandi, to your question, is it political or part of a master plan? I think it's a little bit of both politics and strategy. And the reason is this was the first concrete action that the Biden administration has taken related to the 301 tariffs, outside of calling for comments from public stakeholders, outside of just continuing the tariffs and the exclusions in place. And so what this action included was, one, Sandi, as you said, right, increased tariffs on certain products. It wasn't on all products, as the Biden administration has called it, right? Small yards, high fences. It was increased tariffs on EVs, semiconductors, steel and aluminum, batteries, healthcare products, and some other areas as well. Now, the reason being is why we see it also being a strategic action is because the U.S. has seen that China is making significant investments in certain areas, like solar, like critical minerals, right? Also to getting it more into the semiconductor space. And so at the same time, you look at then the U.S. investments in these areas, more than $860 billion, right, under this administration, under the CHIPS and Science Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act, and the Inflation Reduction Act. They did not want to see, right, that any surge in imports from China would jeopardize the investments that the U.S. is making in those areas. So that's where we see it more of strategic action as well. While it's only valued at $18 billion, right, we see this as more kind of preventative action compared to where the rest of the tariffs have been in the past. But this action was also included with, as Sandi, you mentioned, an extension of some of the exclusions that have been in place. And that's noteworthy, right? Because after the Trump administration released all these tariffs, they provided an opportunity for companies to come in and say, USTR, President Trump, President Biden, exclude these tariffs from my products. And so from, hundreds of exclusions, it then went down to 300 and about so that were still in place. And then in January, USTR said, listen, if you want to protect your exclusion, you got to weigh in with us. And then after, just before Memorial Day, they released that only about 165 of them would still receive the exclusion. So very noteworthy. And it was also too to highlight that the Biden administration was taking seriously as far as what companies were doing to get out of China. And that was a big focus of those review on which exclusions were going to be in place. So, and the third action that was a part of it was a future exclusion process. So very notable actions over the past couple of weeks.
And for sure, just listening to, I'm reminded of how complicated it is. And it's something, both you and I work with daily. As you're working with your clients and counseling them on the impact of all these duties and this trade policy, what advice do you offer them in regards to managing or mitigating the impact that it does have on their business? And maybe you can talk a little bit about the different avenues of relief that are available to companies impacted by the Section 301 tariffs and just how you navigate through all of that.
Absolutely. So first, what I would advise clients is don't expect the tariffs to go away, right? We said that from the very beginning. And so you have to make business decisions understanding they're not going away and there may be limited opportunities for relief. But in saying that, I also advise strongly is then know what USTR, know what the administration and Congress is doing related to those. Because if you're sitting on the sidelines, you're going to miss opportunities available to you. And we saw that first and foremost in this last round of exclusions and whether they were preserved or not for companies. Companies that didn't weigh in, USTR said, we're not going to grant you exclusion, and they eliminated them. So it was all about those companies that decided to be proactive and submit comments and engage with the administration and engage with Congress, and we worked with dozens of them to be able to say, this is why you should provide me with relief. Or alternatively, right, this is why our domestic industry is threatened and you need to keep the tariffs on. So it goes both ways, but no matter what, you have to be aware of what the administration is doing and engage at the appropriate time to support your business.
Right.
But Sandi, to your question, as far as opportunities for relief that are available to companies, there's one notable one that's coming up that a lot of companies may not be aware of if they aren't paying attention is the Biden administration is providing for a very narrow exclusion process. So if you're still importing products from China, particularly machinery that's going to support domestic manufacturing, you have a window to be able to secure financial relief, which is dollars back in their pocket for R&D or for employment, whatever it may be. And USTR is asking, stakeholders to weigh in right now. What products should be eligible for relief? What products should be kept off the list? And so they have until June 28th to submit their comments, and then exclusion process will follow afterwards. So that's the most immediate avenue for relief for companies to really take a close look at.
Right. And it's so hard sometimes, at least, from our perspective, to get clients to understand the importance of weighing in. And I think they're often afraid that it'll backfire on them and, and that some of the knowledge becomes public, but it is really important because these are these small windows.
Yeah.
So Sarah, over the last 4 years in the first round and there's a new term called decoupling from China, and many of our Asian partners have seen a shift of American companies trying to decouple, but that's a difficult process, realigning your supply chain, realigning your vendors, where your suppliers are. And of course, then with the whole movement of nearshoring or friendshoring or whatever shoring you really want to talk about. But have you seen an acceleration of this movement of the supply chain since the Biden administration has extended the original tariffs that the Trump administration put in, and now, kind of double down on this and really to secure the $860 billion that you mentioned of investment?
So Ken, what I would offer is to your point, right? These tariffs went into place to say, hey, companies, get out of China, that decoupling aspect.
Right.
And at the same time, though, when you talk to policymakers, there are some that fully support a full decoupling. but most understand that's not realistic, right, in the world that we live in. However, once the tariffs went into place, and this was actually captured in USTR's 4-year review, the report that they had released, that it worked. There were a number of companies knowing that these tariffs were going to be in place to say, I got to do what I can to get out of China. And some were very public about it. So you saw companies like Owens Corning publicly announce we're going from China to India. Same thing with Cummins. They were going from China to India.
Mhm.
And what USTR had released is essentially the market share for which China owned for the level of imports went from about 22% down to about 14% between the periods of 2017 and 2023. So companies certainly did what the administrations were looking for them to do. At the same time, those countries that you had mentioned, right, in the Asian countries, we also saw Canada, Mexico, the EU, India, all of their level of imports, particularly for products that were subject to 301, went up. So it's working, but the challenge is not all companies can do that, right? They haven't yet. And so that's where you continue to see the necessity for exclusions, and also too some of the harm to particularly what we've seen, a lot of small mid-market companies, right? They might not have the same resources that you may see large companies have, but they haven't been able to shift out. You'll see for reasons of quality, right? For reasons of capacity. You have to have kind of multi-country approach to where you source your products. Also to cost. And USTR unfortunately doesn't care much about cost, right? If that's the sole reason, they're saying, sorry, we're still asking you to get out. But what's going to be interesting for those companies, if it's all about cost, is if there's a change in the administration at all, if it were to be Trump and what his threats are of increasing the tariffs even further from 25%, how does that difference between a production in Mexico and production in China change, right, for their calculation of where they're going to source from? So there's so much uncertainty for businesses. It's a real challenge for them of understanding what's going to come next and how do we plan accordingly for it. But some companies still haven't been able to shift elsewhere.
Yeah, I could see that because some of our clients have actually looked for alternative sources, but at the same time, with the how do I say, the increased supply from the Chinese manufacturers for lack of exports to other, is that they've actually seen their raw costs go down. And where transportation costs might be going up, as you know, Sandi, on a day, but their actual cost per unit coming from the same Chinese factories have been reduced 20-25% since 4 years ago. Kind of makes up for the tariff. And so there's not this shift. You talk about quality, the tooling, the relationship, the contracts, all of that capacity. It's really difficult to switch your supply chain in less than a year, 2 years, even 3 years. But I can see this decoupling is just accelerating, at least from our customer base.
Absolutely. Well, I think it kind of circles back to where we started. None of us expected them to last for 4 years. And now that we know, they're not going away, and certainly not going away anytime soon, regardless of the administration, I think, it'll be interesting to see. And the stakes are getting higher. So I think, the companies are forced, with navigating through this. So, Sarah, in closing, any other comments, to importers, exporters, working in China on, how to best navigate through some of this, other than paying attention to the news daily?
No, Sandi, what I would just in closing remarks, what I would say is really encouraging companies while we work with them, really understanding opportunities and risks through trade policy. It's understanding how you can be proactive rather than reactive, right? It's understanding how you can have a seat at the table. So those that are making the decisions, right, can be informed about how domestic companies are impacted by our broader trade policy. So,
yeah, great advice.
Okay.
Sarah Helton, thank you so much
you.
for joining us today.
Thank you,
Sarah.
Sandi. Thank you, Ken. Appreciate it as always.
Thank you for joining Talking Trade.
You've been listening to Talking Trade, Sponsored by MMAC's World Trade Association and Michael Best Strategies.